So let's start with the Terraform provider. So Maurice, I'll let you share, and you can walk through that one.
Right. Maybe as a first thing, I want to add one opportunity to contribute maybe to the slide that you presented earlier. If someone's interested in a Terraform provider for OpenFGA, this is what I've been working on, and it's also open source. So if you want to contribute to something like this, please feel free. It's called OpenFGA. It's in the Terraform registry. There is a GitHub repository for it, and yeah, contributions are very much welcome. But why did I actually start looking into this? I found myself in a pretty similar situation, I think, as Jeremy, I think it was. I wanted to look into OpenFGA and wanted to evaluate if this is something that we can help our clients with by implementing a solution like this for some of their authorization questions. And at the beginning, it was quite nice to just get started with the CLI and whatnot. But at some point, I felt it to be a bit, let's say, cumbersome to get started with infrastructure as code, so to say, for the configuration and the deployment. And having used Terraform a lot in the past, I thought, hey, maybe there's a gap here that can be filled. So I set out to create this Terraform provider, and this is what I want to demonstrate to you today. So I've prepared something here, and hopefully this will work out nicely. I mean, everyone knows how live demos go, but let's have our fingers crossed. All right, let's start perhaps with looking at the provider. You can just use the OpenFGA provider, and then there's different ways how you can connect it to your OpenFGA server. So you can, for example, either use no authentication, which should probably only be used for some demoing and testing. Here you just have to provide your API URL, but for all the configuration options for the provider, you can basically always use some environment variables as well if you prefer this kind of setup. You can also use different kinds of authentication. You can use the API token authentication if you either use a pre-shared secret or you already obtained an OIDC token, or you can use the full-blown OIDC authentication where you specify your client ID and client secret. And again, it can also all be specified by the corresponding environment variables. But yeah, once we have the provider set up, let's go ahead and initialize our Terraform here. And then we can start by creating our first store. So let's have a look at our store Terraform file. There is the Terraform resource for a store. It's pretty simple. You just provide a name, and then you can start creating your stores. In addition, there are also data sources for stores. There are two in particular. One is the OpenFGA stores data source, which gives you a list of all the stores in your OpenFGA server. Or you can also get a specific store if you already know its ID. Then you just use the OpenFGA store. You can provide the ID to it, and then it will get the information from the store back. So let's go ahead and apply this real quick. This will create one new store. We say apply. That seems to have worked. And if we go ahead and run our CLI real quick here, we see that a new store was created. And if we also want to have a look at the Terraform state afterwards to look at the data sources, you can see that in our data source, we have an array and we have our data store in it, and same for the data store, the store that we explicitly specified. So this is how we can create a store. And once we have a store, the next thing that we, of course, want to do is to create an authorization model. So for this, I've provided some models here. There's a JSON definition, there's a DSL definition, and there's also a modular definition. And you cannot use all those different types of model definitions to create an authorization model. And how would you go ahead and do this? Well, I borrowed a page out of AWS's book, basically, when it comes to policies, like IAM policies, what they do. So there are data sources for specifying an authorization model document. So you can see them basically here. There are 4 different kinds, so to say. You can create such a data source and provide it either with a DSL string, or you can give it a file path to a mod file. You can give it the JSON definition directly, or you can also use like a native definition where you just define the model directly inside the Terraform configuration. Just be aware that there is a restriction to the nesting depth when you use the native way because of the specifics of schemas in Terraform. So I would probably rather recommend to use one of those methods. But what this does is it gives us a data source that we can then use to deploy our authorization model. So to actually create our authorization model, we define this authorization model resource. We specify the store ID to deploy it to, and then we have to deploy it, supply the model JSON to it. The reason why I created those different data sources here is that they will ensure stability of your configuration files. So you first create the data source, and then you can use the result of this data source to supply it to the resource. And this will make sure that no matter the formatting or anything, as long as the specification is semantically equal, it will also not trigger any updates of the Terraform or of this authorization model. And then again, there are some data sources related to extracting authorization models. There's again an aggregated data source to get all the authorization models in a specific store. Then there's also a data source to get the latest model. And there is a data source to get a specific model. Basically, the last 2 are the same. It just depends on whether you specify an explicit ID or you leave the ID empty, then it will just get the latest for you. And if we go ahead and apply this one, we will now see that we have a new authorization model deployed in our store. There we go. It was just created. And then we can again have a look at the Terraform state afterwards. So this is probably a bit hard to see now, but what you might be able to see is here is the data source where we provided the DSL definition. This is our input. So this was the DSL input, and the result is just a JSON representation of this authorization model that is stable and then can be used in the resource later on. And at the end, we will also be able to see, sorry, no, this is the other command. Let's clear all that. Let's look at the data sources that we defined here in the end. It gives us a list of all the authorization models that are deployed. It gives us the latest model that is deployed, and it can also give us a specific model. I mean, in this case, they're all the same because we just deployed one. But hopefully this gives you a hint as to how authorization models can be deployed. And once we have our authorization model deployed, the next thing we want to do is, of course, create tuples for it. And this is what we can also do with Terraform, and which might be especially relevant when we look at the authorization logic of OpenFGA itself, because this could be something where you, I mean, I don't think it's completely rolled out already, but there is an access control feature for OpenFGA planned, right? So this could be used to configure such an authorization or access control feature. Yeah, to create a relationship tuple, we basically specify the store ID and the authorization model ID. Of course, we can reference the resources that we've created earlier, and then we can just define our user, relation, and object, just like we know it. For this demo, I am creating 2 tuples here, and then we can also use some data sources to read back those tuples. We can either get all the tuples that are available in the store, or we can filter those tuples using queries to only get specific tuples back. So let's go ahead and apply this one. This should now create 2 resources for those tuples. And once we have applied them, we can have a look at the tuples that are now in our store. And sure enough, the tuples that we've created are now in our OpenFGA store. Then we can again have a quick look at our Terraform state to see the result of the data sources. And there we go. Here we have the list of all the tuples in the store. Here we specified the query on an object. So document OpenFGA. That's actually interesting. I think, the reason why it doesn't return anything is because I forgot to actually depend on the creation of the tuples first. So it already read the store before the tuples were created, just Terraform specifics. But at least in the last case, we can see that it actually returned the data because here I actually depended on the creation. All right. I've seen that there are already some questions coming into the chat. Maybe I'll answer them in the end. And then I'll continue to the last thing that I wanted to show you, because now we've created our store, authorization model, and tuples. Next up, we of course also want to run some queries. And for this, there are again some data sources. You can run a check query. You can run a check query with contextual tuples. You can run a check query with some context, so for conditional tuples. And then there's also other queries like the list objects query. You can again use some contextual tuples for this, or you can also again provide some context to it. You can list the users again with contextual tuples or context. More or less all the queries that are also defined in the CLI are supported here. So this should then hopefully just work if we apply it now. All right, so nothing to add because it's just data sources. So I can just say yes. And then there is a very big command here, which at least should show you that, okay, this check query, it returns us back a result, which in this case is false. So apparently John is not a viewer of this document, but in the next scenario where we insert a contextual tuples where John is a viewer of this document, it gives us now the result of true. So yeah, those queries are also implemented, and those are basically the 4 big topics, right? Stores, authorization models, tuples, and queries. And this is the current status of this Terraform provider. In the end, of course, we also want to make sure that we can destroy everything that we've just created. And yeah, sure enough, they got destroyed. If we have a look at the output, all the stores are gone, and with it, all the data. And this is the end of the demo. Thank you so much for listening in. I've seen that there are some questions in the chat. All right, there we go. There's a question by Stephen. I know it's early, but is there any ability to create the model using modular models? Yes, there is. So if you have a look at the authorization models, there is a data source for providing a mod file. So, yeah, I see that it was already answered. So sorry for answering it again, but yeah, you can define a mod file path and we'll use the modular model for it. And again, it will then just compile it and it will result in a JSON representation. So you can then just use this when you create your resource. You could just say, okay, instead of using this data source, I use the data source of mod, use the results. So this will be the JSON representation of the compiled model. And this will then again, just work similarly to all the other types.